So I'm going to read here from Have a Good Trip, Exploring the Magic Mushroom Experience, a book that was just released by Eugenia, who's a phenomenal author and writer and has been very influential on me. And Eugenia is actually the person who wrote the foreword for my book. So I figured I would come on and read in her words some of her experiences that she had on her sort of deep dive into learning about psychedelic mushrooms. And she treated it in a very sort of objective way as an author, where she's writing about her experiences, the people she met and talked to, stating the most recent research, the chemistry, the goods and the bads, in a, very literate, journalistic kind of way. And I think that's important, especially in the sort of magic mushroom space where there's a whole lot of bullshit out there. And Eugenia cuts right through it. Last night I read the prologue, I'm going to read the author's note, and I'll go ahead and respond to any comments or questions you guys throw in the chat, but mostly I'm going to be reading this book. The psychedelic vernacular is developing at a faster pace than copy editing manuals can be revised. The language we use to describe psilocybin, the experiences it occasions, and the people involved in them lies in a murky realm between science, slang, and anthropology. Psilocybin, for example, may be referred to as a drug, a medicine, or a sacrament. Since the state of the vernacular today tends to be interpretive, I've made certain choices regarding nomenclature. Many people object to calling psilocybin a drug, the word I use, and have taken to calling the psychedelic mushroom a medicine instead. I disagree with this standpoint, but this is how Eugenia is approaching it. Medicine has come to represent an antidote for everything from OCD to societal ills. But as the late psychonaut, someone who uses psychedelics to explore alternative realities, Kalindi Illy said, medicine implies sickness. People who use mushrooms for mind expansion, spiritual quickening, or just to have fun are not using mushrooms to heal something broken, but to enhance their lives. Therefore, I use medicine only where it appears in quotations or applies to treating a physical or mental ailment. I understand the unease people feel with calling psilocybin a drug, but I don't want to characterize it as separate from other drugs that people use. And I think that's an important point. We use a lot of drugs on a daily basis we don't think of as drugs, but are drugs. Caffeine, number one drug that most people and adults consume. And if you don't consume caffeine, you definitely consume sugar, which arguably is both nutrition, but also a drug. A lot of people consume alcohol, that is a drug. There's a lot of things that we intake as humans that are technically drugs, or even entheogens, which are plant-based, fungal-based compounds that are somewhat mind-altering, and caffeine definitely falls under that umbrella. Mind-altering, and caffeine definitely falls under that umbrella. Someone had asked me, how can I start a project to study fungi? You don't need any help to start a project to study fungi. Just go ahead and start studying fungi. That's what I did. The best platform, I think, to explore fungi in your area and learn about them is a platform called iNaturalist. It's a website, inaturalist.org. It's also an app, and you can find links to that in my bio. Thank you, Jasmine. I'm glad you like my posters. Dr. Carl Hart, one of the world's foremost experts on the effects of recreational drugs, terms this differentiation psychedelic exceptionalism, which I think is a good point, that people who study and are really into psychedelics often see them as separate from all the other drugs, and in which they are in terms of their effects and their level of risk associated with them. That they're much less risky, they're much less addictive. Psychedelics in general are less addictive than caffeine. Caffeine is very physically addictive. It's part of the reason so many people consume it. But it's totally societally normal to consume caffeine, whereas it's not normal for people to consume psychedelics, although that is being normalized, and that's part of what Eugenia talks about in this book, Have a Good Trip. So that's why I'm reading about it to you guys, because I'm not allowed to talk about psychedelics myself, but I think through the lens of reading an author who is talking about it, I think we're in the clear. But we'll see. I'm reading a book right now. That's what I'm doing. I'm not expressing my own views, I'm just reading what she has to say. So Dr. Carl Hart and psychedelic exceptionalism. The notion that psychedelics aren't like the dirtier hard drugs. All drugs are psychoactive substances, said Hart on the Bad Faith podcast, and we are all seeking the same thing when we use them. What we are talking about is making social distinctions with the drugs. Lots of people use the phrase psychedelic space to describe anything from personal boundaries surrounding a tripper to psychedelic-friendly advocacy in business categories, as in, I'm an entrepreneur in the psychedelic space. I use psychedelic scene because scene to me suggests an archetype of activity, whereas space makes more sense to me when it is used to describe the protective envelope a trip sitter contains for the tripper. Tripper is another word that I use instead of journeyer or voyager or like, and trip instead of journey or voyage. It's too bad that tripper has so much baggage related as it is to counterculture, but I think it just has a more historical precedence. Another word I have wrestled with was ceremony. Many people call their trips ceremonies, except where someone is describing their intentions that way. I only use ceremony in specifically religious or anthropological contexts, and I think that's important too, because there's been a lot of cultural appropriation, basically people doing drugs and calling it a ceremony, but you're not really putting the intention or the time, effort, or paying attention to the anthropological things that make it a ceremony. You're just doing drugs and pretending it's not doing drugs by calling it a ceremony. So I think Eugenia is in the right here to be defining this nomenclature with regards to how she wants to address these things in the book. I also tussled with how to describe the indigenous zones of mushroom use, basically agricultural villages in Central America, versus the post-discovery zones of mushroom use as in the US, Europe, and Australia, along with their capitalist hubbub. Another good point. And the different value systems they represent. I settled on using the indigenous world versus the non-indigenous world. There is some disagreement about whether cultivars, the breeds of a particular species of mushrooms, should be capitalized or not. I'm capping because reading albino penis envy in all lowercase just looks weird to me. That's one that people are constantly asking me, have you heard of this? And I'm like, of course I've heard of it. Unfortunately, I cannot talk about it myself, but I can read Eugenia's words. Mushroom genus and species names are always italicized. That's a well-established form and our convention. I used it in my book. Also, as I describe in this book, when we metabolize psilocybin, it converts into another molecule, psilocin, and it is psilocin that causes the trip. That's the thing that actually passes the blood-brain barrier and causes the effects. Psilocybin is the prodrug to psilocin. For this reason, I wanted to use psilocin in the text, but I decided to bow to common practice and use psilocybin in most contexts. Even though it is a federally banned drug, some people are so enthusiastic about the benefits of psilocybin that are willing to take risks to promote it. One woman, a microdose consultant and passionate advocate of psilocybin, told me I could include her name as she was willing to go to jail for the medicine. But I said no. I masked everyone who asked and some who did not. So this is part 1, Anatomy of a Trip. And just to be clear, I am reading a book called Have a Good Trip by author Eugenia Bone. So these are not my words. These are published words from a recent book that just came out by Eugenia Bone. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for her and am really interested in what she has to say. I'm going to be doing a live interview with her about this book where we discuss her insights into the psychedelic community and her thoughts on magic mushrooms once I finish reading her book. And part of the way I motivate myself to read books is to do it on live. So you guys are benefiting from that. Considering psilocybin. Before I started this book, the last trip I had taken was in 2011. I took 2 grams of the most popular magic mushroom, Psilocybe cubensis, with a few other people in a meadow high in the San Juan Mountains. That's Colorado. It was a beautiful Colorado day. The views were so long and wide I could see 2 rainstorms at once, though they were far away and many miles apart. The landscape rippled to the west, a giant wrinkled bedspread of red rock and green pine forests. It would have been beautiful under any circumstances. On mushrooms, it was extraordinary. My trip was mostly merry, a journey that took me from curiosity, what is this scratchy noise, to amazement. It's the busy lives of a million insects crawling through the grass, navigating their gargantuan obstacle of me, to uncontrollable giggles as I realized I am part of the landscape, to them as the rocks are to me. Tripping like this, joyful and safe, defines the trips many people take today and the trips people have taken ever since magic mushrooms were first introduced to the non-indigenous world late in the 1950s. They were, and are, or can be, a way of altering one's perception that leads to a greater appreciation of nature, of the marvelous details we don't normally notice. How much more fascinating is a rain shower when you see it is composed of countless individual drops, glinting like pear-shaped mirrors. How delightful to be alive amid all of this. So that's something I can certainly mirror in my experience. When you are on this substance out in nature, you feel very connected to everything, you see everything, you notice so many things. And a lot of the filters that we put on a daily basis to kind of get through the world, if you stopped and stared at every incredible thing in the world all the time, you wouldn't get very far. So I feel like we kind of put on blinders to how insanely beautiful and just fascinating the natural world in particular is. And I feel like sometimes when people have consumed this particular mushroom, it helps them take down those filters and really appreciate what they're looking at. And that's what Eugenia is talking about. There are, and always will be, meadow trippers. Folks who use psychedelics to enhance their experience in nature, to free their minds from its binding for a while. But just because someone is tripping in a meadow doesn't mean it's all sunshine and glistening raindrops. I've been in the woods with fellow trippers who spent the whole adventure puking or facing realizations about mistakes they've made with their families or friends, and then wandering among their fellow trippers in search of someone coherent enough to help them talk it through. I spent hours, or what seemed like hours, swatting mosquitoes off a comatose friend as he lay in the grass, traveling behind his sunglasses to a foreign lands. Some people have bad trips, too. Some even suffer psychotic breaks, though according to the scientific community, a person diagnosed with, or who has a close family history of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder is the most likely candidate. But we didn't know that at hippie boarding school I attended in the 1970s. We didn't even have the mental health counselors. We had a bad-tempered nurse who dispensed the narcotic Darvon for everything from menstrual cramps to learning your parents were getting divorced. There wasn't much talk about mental illness in those days. When kids fell apart, we dorm mates assumed they had become undone by psychedelics, which at that time were widely hyped as capable of frying your brain. I remember one girl who burst into rooms, long hair wild, pimples aflame, hyper and articulate and brilliant at math. One day she disappeared from school, just gone. She wrote me a letter that said how much she'd missed her friends, and I never heard from her again. We all thought she'd been sent away because she took psychedelics. Today, I think she might have been diagnosed with ADHD. The art and science of mental health diagnoses has changed a lot since the 1970s, some would argue. I think that it's at times excessive. In the late 1990s, I met an administrator at a private grade school in New York City who encouraged parents to put their hyper little boys on ADHD medication, an amphetamine known around town as the good grade pill. A generation of teenagers have been prescribed antidepressants to deal with depression and more prescriptions to deal with the side effects. Someone asked, are there poisonous lookalikes for lion's mane? No, there are not. Hericium do not have poisonous lookalikes, so they're safe to hunt for. A 20-year-old relative of mine at one point was taking 3 different medications to treat her depression. She told me all of those meds made her feel like she had lost track of her personality. To me, it seems like the resurgence of mainstream study in psychedelics treat mental disorders beginning in 2006 after a 30-year hiatus had coincided with the 2006 after a 30-year hiatus had coincided with the evolution of mental health diagnosis and the subsequent need for new effective mental health drugs. I know firsthand that the need is great. In 2014, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times arguing for the rescheduling of psilocybin, the psychoactive molecule present in a wide range of mushrooms, but especially in the genus Psilocybe. Rescheduling psilocybin from its current status as a drug with no potential medical use doesn't imply blanket legalization. No one is talking about making psilocybin available at your local bodega or allowing children to purchase the stuff like gum. But it does have great therapeutic promise for an array of disorders and should be moved to a drug category that would make research less arduous and allow for compassionate use provisions. Within hours of publication, I received hundreds of emails who were suffering from depression or PTSD or other disorders and wanted to know how they might get mushrooms. Even folks with complaints that didn't meet the standards of a diagnosis wanted to know more. And I hear this a lot whenever I mention it in a talk or I even acknowledge that psychedelic mushrooms exist. People are immediately like, how do I get some? And I'm like, I am not the right person to ask. I can't talk to you about that. Both legally and responsibility-wise, I cannot tell you how to acquire these things. It's better to know someone and or do the research yourself on how to come by this kind of mushroom. It's not as hard as you might think. Psilocybin can positively impact non-sufferers of mental ailments. They did for me, and I wrote about it. The first time I ate a magic mushroom as an adult was in 2009, again on a mountaintop in the San Juans. I experienced several small epiphanies, the kinds of self-realizations that are the rewards of hours of therapy, but one in particular reminded me. As the drug wore off, I went back to my hotel room to take a hot bath. For a moment, I thought that might not be a good idea, as bath time is when women my age can be very self-critical, and I didn't want the sight of my thickening waistline to veer me into a bad trip. I was in the tub. I envisioned my body as a ship that was taking me through life, and that's what made it beautiful. With that change in perception, I stopped feeling regretful about losing my looks. Instead, I felt overwhelming gratitude for having a body at all. That's a powerful thought. It was a tremendous relief that I still feel today. I received a letter from a gentleman after I published my editorial who wanted his wife to try the drug because she felt so badly about how age had ravaged her beauty. The response to that op-ed was overwhelming, and I felt like I had irresponsibly unleashed hope where hope was truly premature. I tried to respond to the loads of correspondence from strangers who shared such intimate despair. I was deeply moved by their stories, but I really didn't have anything to offer. I did have coffee with one man. His ex-wife had reached out to me requesting I at least talk to him, and he cried the whole time. And so often people just want someone to listen to their story. We live in a world where we have very little patience to listen to each other. Things have to be so fast. So anyone here sitting listening to this live stream, thanks for listening. I'm reading a book called Have a Good Trip by Eugenia. It just came out a couple days ago. I feel like I have so much more to offer. I could offer that fellow... I feel like I have so much more I could offer that fellow today. First, I'd make sure he understood that there is no prescription. You cannot reliably eat magic mushrooms and expect whatever is plaguing you to disappear. This is very true, right? People get so excited about the concept and promise of magic mushrooms that they hear about it and then think, oh, that'll solve all my problems. As she said earlier in this book, they are not a panacea. They are not a cure-all. They might be a tool that you can use on a journey of mental health and self-discovery, but they're not going to solve your problems. Nothing will, other than facing your problems, thinking about them, dealing with them. And life is never as easy as just taking a pill and having something go away, except occasionally in antibiotics and like an infection. But even then, more complicated. So you can't expect whatever's plaguing you to disappear, like taking an aspirin for a headache. The scientists in this field are plugging away, trying to figure out what the abilities and limitations of the drug are, but that research is in its early stages. And the job is made all the more difficult because we do not all act under the influence of psilocybin. but I'd like to tell him there's a wealth of helpful anecdotal information if he is willing to accept the fact that different people experience the drug differently. Over the years, I have talked with hundreds of people who use these mushrooms for a variety of reasons, from entertainment to therapy to spiritual awakening, who have experienced personal insights into work and self and have generously shared their experiences. I've also spent many, many hours reading the various online psychedelic forums, mostly Reddit and Shroomery. Forum is singular, fora is the plural, but to avoid confusion, I'll use forums. She's very technical as a writer. The demographics of these forums seem to skew white and male, which limits the variety of experiences reported. Nonetheless, the subcategories like R, bad trip, provide a wealth of views and sometimes risky opinions on all aspects of mushroom use and its effects that simply don't exist elsewhere. As the writer Ed Perdue pointed out, go on any psychedelic Reddit page and you're likely to find a much more genuine picture of what's happening in the psychedelic renaissance than any asinine puff piece on CNN. And that's a great point, is real people online talking about their experiences have way more insight into what it's like to actually do these things than someone who's been paid by CNN or some major news outlet to do some sort of fluff piece where they aren't actually experiencing anything and they aren't going into this community themselves. So, one thing is very clear. Different doses make different trips. But regardless of dose size, the chances of positive outcomes are likely increased when trippers manage their expectations and employ caution. This can be accomplished by undertaking the basic pharmacology, or understanding the basic pharmacology, to the extent it is currently understood. The general effects that varying doses seem to occasion, the importance of a safe setting, and the companionship of trustworthy people. Psilocybin isn't mechanistic the way a statin is. It's neurological. For example, I benefited from the mushroom emotionally because the drug offered me the opportunity to see myself and how I interact with the world from a new perspective. That, in turn, affected how I felt about myself and others. When I am writing a book, I usually have a novel that I read at night to relax. As is often the case, I encounter something that resonates with me when I am thinking about during the day. So it was with the murder mystery, Music of the Spheres. In it, a character paraphrases Isaac Newton. It is our greater or lesser knowledge of constant factors that constitutes their relative stability. In the book, he is applying it to astronomy, but applies to tripping as well. What you can know and what you realize you can't know about psilocybin are its effects are a measure of the degree of confidence you have in the experience overall. Ultimately, it's determined by dose plus intention minus risk, and that is key to this understanding. I'm going to say that again. Dose plus intention minus risk is part of what makes a good experience, right? Dialing in the dose for the kind of experience you're looking for, having the intention for what kind of experience you want to have, and then removing any risk factors. And so that could be something like, make sure you're in a safe space, make sure you have people around who can take care of you if something goes wrong. Don't do this out in like a giant public space or at a giant music festival where you don't have a safe space to retreat to. Taking the risk out of the experience is part of what makes sure that you do not have a bad trip. So again, dose plus intention minus risk. And I think Eugenia nailed that. It's a good equation. I'm going to dive deeper into these knowns and unknowns in subsequent chapters, but let's start with an overview of the key points when considering psilocybin, what the drug is and what it basically does, how dosing is measured to determine trip types, and the importance of setting an intention and making a plan to mitigate the risks. So I wrote about this in my book as well. I didn't write a whole book about it, but there is a section in my book where I did talk about psychedelics, dosage, preparation, intention, things to be careful about. And I think Eugenia is going to do a much deeper dive here, but I did cover it in my book because I think it's important to talk about, and I couldn't write a whole book about mushrooms without at least addressing it. So I can't talk about it here on TikTok or really anywhere online, but you can read about it in my book. The basic pharmacology. When we talk about magic mushrooms, we're usually talking about the species of mushrooms in the psilocybe genus, almost all of which contain the tryptamines psilocybin and psilocin. Tryptamine is a type of alkaloid, an organic compound that plants and fungi produce that has profound pharmacological effects on us. And indeed, these molecules are responsible for the psychoactive effects we experience. Other alkaloids are present in trace amounts too, like baeocystin, norbaeocystin, and norpsilocybin, though no one really knows whether they modify our trips. But I don't see the wisdom in dismissing them. I like to think of the magic in these mushrooms as a cocktail of psychoactive compounds dominated by psilocybin and psilocin. Psilocybin and psilocin are classic psychedelics like mescaline, LSD, and DMT, and they all operate on the brain similarly. Here's how. She talks about in the bottom, there's a footnote that says non-classic psychedelics like ibogaine, ketamine, MDMA, amnium muscaria act on other parts of the brain. So they're interacting with different types of receptors. After you swallow it, the stew of acids in your gut breaks the mushroom down. Acids break apart the psilocybin molecule too. They strip off one of the molecule's components, the phosphate group. Psilocybin without its phosphate group is a different molecule called psilocin. And psilocin is a molecule slippery enough to pass through the blood-brain barrier. Basically, it goes from being polar to nonpolar, so suddenly it can pass through membranes. The semi-porous gateway, pass through the blood-brain barrier, the semi-porous gateway between whether or not it is in your bloodstream and the ultra-sensitive environment of your brain. So even though we say we are tripping on psilocybin, we're actually tripping on psilocin. That is the molecule that enters our brain and affects the receptors. Psilocin is also present in the mushroom, though to a lesser degree it passes through the blood-brain barrier along with the psilocin made from dephosphorylated psilocybin. The more psilocin naturally present in the mushroom, the faster the effects will come on because there is no conversion process happening in your gut. It goes right to the brain. And this happens when you eat fresh psilocybe mushrooms. They are much stronger because there's quite a bit of psilocin in them. Dried psilocybe mushrooms lose most of their psilocin, so then what you're consuming is the psilocybin, which then has to be converted. So fresh ones are much stronger. You should be very careful with those. Psilocin is the molecule class that causes the psychedelic effects we feel when we eat magic mushrooms, influencing our perceptions both sensory and emotional. That's accomplished because the chemical structure of psilocin is very similar to the chemical structure of the neurotransmitter serotonin, so similar that it can dock into serotonin receptors on neural cells and stimulate the transmission of electric impulses from cell to cell along serotogenic pathways in the brain. Your brain accepts psilocin as if it were serotonin, but of course it is not, and it doesn't do the same thing. What it's doing in the brain exactly is hypothetical, but the prevailing notion is that the psilocin affects, even disrupts, established patterns of electrical impulses in regions involved with mood, memory, cognition, and all of the senses. It's as if, wrote the author Andy Lecter, a new alien but curiously compatible piece of software is thrown into the brain's computer, disrupting its normal operations in novel and unexpected ways. A psilocybin trip typically lasts 4 to 6 hours, though an 8-hour trip is not uncommon, although I find that is more if you're eating the fruiting body versus making tea. Tea tends to go through your system faster and also hits you faster. It doesn't cause a large hangover like alcohol, but you may very well be tired or headachy after tripping. For me, after trip, I feel mentally spent, like I've been reading all night, but emotionally open, just like an unclogged sink. So I think that's a good description of how you might feel and sort of the reintegration phase. Fairly tired, a little kind of like mentally fritzed, but your heart is open, your mind is open, and a lot of the mental baggage you may have been carrying around is hopefully shed, and that's part of the benefit of going on a trip. Like she says, have a good trip. So, different doses make different trips. A warning when it comes to different doses and the trips they may occasion. There is no one-size-fits-all dosing schedule. A big dose for me might barely register for someone else, and that's not necessarily because of gender, age of adults, body weight, or metabolism. Those factors don't seem to matter. I suppose, since we all have the same size brain. Dose size cannot be predictably reproduced from one person to the next. My friend who took what is generally considered a heroic dose, 5 grams of a moderately strong species of psychedelic mushroom, traveled in his mind to foreign lands. However, someone with a history of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI use, might spend the whole afternoon feeling frustrated, unable to let go, buzzy and distracted but not tripping. And this is very true. SSRIs massively change the way the brain interacts with this kind of molecule. And so it's very much recommended to not try psilocybin or other psychedelics if you're currently taking an SSRI type drug. This book does not have any illustrations, otherwise I would show them to you. If there is one, I will show it to you. No cool sensory experiences, no euphoria, no revelations, just disappointment in the drug and themselves for being unable to benefit from it. And someone who took 2 grams, expecting to feel one with nature without getting lost on the trail, might end up on their back for hours in some kind of hyperspace of their own mind. All this could happen, all this has happened. The only way to judge tolerance is to start with very low doses, and if appropriate, increase incrementally. This is called titrating, and it's one of the ways that many trippers individualize their dose. That said, here are general dosing guidelines for psilocybe cubensis. These guidelines are widely available in psychedelic sites and in books like Medicinal Mushrooms by Christopher Hobbs, an herbalist with the sober temperament of a high school health ed teacher. I just saw Chris Hobbs yesterday. He's a great guy. I like his book on medicinal mushrooms. He speaks fairly openly about his experiences using and prescribing psychedelic mushrooms in a medicinal sense. He's got a PhD in alternative medicine. He's a little bit woo-woo, but I trust Chris Hobbs pretty much more than anyone else in the medicinal mushroom space. And especially that includes talking about psilocybe mushrooms. A microdose is a subperceptual dose. That means you don't experience any psychedelic effects. It doesn't affect your daily routine. If you're microdosing properly, meaning you are consuming a subperceptual dose, then you can exercise and eat the way you normally do. You should be able to drive, attend your job, go to the grocery store, help the kids with homework. Microdoses are usually taken to manage mood or productivity. Those who microdose psilocybin to address mood claim it doesn't elevate their frame of mind so much as remove their negative state. That the minuscule amount of serotonin receptor stimulus that they're getting brings them to a normal baseline, or to paraphrase Ayelet Waldman in her book about microdosing LSD, A Really Good Day, it just helps you feel not shitty. It also helps some people cope with the stress of normal life and stay chill. Those who microdose magic mushrooms for productivity claim it helps them focus and stay energized at work. I found that to be true for me. I have the opposite experience. When I've tried microdosing, I cannot focus. I cannot have linear thoughts. I'm happy, and sometimes I'm able to do things that I've been procrastinating on, but it does not help me with productivity. And so I think people experience things very differently depending on your own personal brain chemistry. I don't think microdosing is bad, but I don't do it all the time because it doesn't make me more productive. If anything, it sort of makes me more likely to go just like chase waterfalls all afternoon. I might sit down to write, and I end up doing yard work for 3 hours. So, pick your poison. A microdose applies to any psychedelic, but in the case of magic mushrooms, it is considered 50 to 500 milligrams of dried psilocybe cubensis. Usually I'd say 100 to 200 milligrams is what people consider a microdose. Up to 500 milligrams is not really a microdose in my book. You're starting to get into actually tripping at that point. The most in psilocybe cubensis is sort of the standard for this, and that's confusing because within psilocybe cubensis there's a whole bunch of different strains: golden teacher, albino penis envy, all these different things, and those can have different relative strengths. And then depending on who grew them, how well they were grown, what they were grown on, how they were dried and processed, and then a number of other factors, they can have varying strengths. So it is very hard, like she says, to actually prescribe dosage for this kind of thing, but we're providing some general guidelines. And my guidelines are very similar to what she's suggesting. What I have in my book mirrors a lot of what she has in her book, although we didn't coordinate on that. We just also both did our research and have a lot of subjective experience as well as objective experience with looking at this. Ooh, excuse me. Okay, for me, a dose of over 160 milligrams is perceptible, depending on the cultivar of Psilocybe cubensis. More on that in a minute. There are many scientists who are skeptical that microdosing does anything at all and believe the benefits people claim are due to a placebo effect. That may be true, but a plethora of anecdotal testimony suggests microdosing does have an effect, so much that researchers have given up on it. Oh, haven't given up on it. On the other hand, lots of people swear by homeopathy, and there's absolutely no evidence that that does anything. So I think homeopathy is the idea that you like dilute things down more and more and more, and then you're getting some sort of molecular signature. That has absolutely no basis in science. Homeopathy is complete bunk, and as a biochemist, I can tell you it's just not real. That being said, there's ways that you stack different molecules together, and maybe subthreshold doses of something stacked with other things may have some sort of effect, whether or not it's fully perceptible. But homeopathy as a pseudoscience is nothing but that. So, Daniel, I wish I could talk to you more about that, but what I recommend in my book is tea, making a tea. A low dose between 500 milligrams and 1 gram may produce euphoric feelings and sensory enhancement. It can make you feel a little high, a little more enthusiastic, a little more excited, a little more appreciative. A friend of mine, a real estate guy, took about half a gram of strong cubensis cultivar and went to the ballet. Usually a bit of a chore for him, but his wife likes it. And he said it was the best. Usually a bit of a chore for him, but his wife likes it. And he said it was the best, most incredible time he'd ever had at the ballet. 1 to 2.5 grams may produce some psychedelic effects as well. In the mid-20th century, clinical trials of LSD, frequently low-dose use called psychotherapy, or psycholytic therapy, was studied for its therapeutic value. And this is back in like the 60s and 70s. They were doing real, mental health studies, psychiatry with psychedelics. This was before it was scheduled for political reasons, not for health reasons. Psychedelics were scheduled as Schedule 1 for political reasons by Nixon, who was, previous to Trump, the worst president we'd ever had. But I digress. These are, for many people, manageable doses. What Christopher Hobbs described to me as a museum dose, meaning you can go to a museum and enjoy yourself without freaking out. Some use low doses as a substitute for drinking on a night out. You get high, but there's no hangover. But this dose size can be tricky. Many times I've heard stories about people who have taken 2 grams of magic mushrooms thinking they just have a super time at a wedding reception, a music festival, an afternoon at the beach, and it turned out to be a full-on, unable to manage things like making change at a store kind of experience. I think that's because at this dose, this size, and this is true of microdosing as well, the psilocybin content of different cultivars can make a substantial difference. So that is a very good point. And again, I'm somewhat nervous about the guidelines that I gave people in my book because it varies a lot by strain and your own personal chemistry, and even like where you're at in the day, how much you've eaten, and then even what you've eaten. Someone in my comments is asking here if I consume it with chocolate or orange juice because there is some thought that potentially like vitamin C or compounds in chocolate may enhance the absorption or even bioavailability of that psilocin molecule in your system. So that's up to you guys to experiment with and figure out. You can go on the online forums and read about it yourself. Of all the psilocybe species that contain psilocybin and psilocin, Psilocybe cubensis is the most used because it is easily cultivated. But even then, there can be different potencies for Psilocybe cubensis cultivars. Albino penis envy, for example, is significantly stronger than golden teacher. It's like horse breeds. A Clydesdale and a Shetland pony are both Equus cabalis, I guess that's the scientific name for a horse, but one is 4 times as heavy as the other. This is, like talking like a German Shepherd and a Chihuahua are both technically the same species, but they are not the same dog, right? Someone taking 2 grams of Psilocybe cubensis may think it's a museum dose, but if the cultivar is albino penis envy and the amount of psilocybin that 2 grams delivers may be significantly more. At this intermediate dose level of 2 grams, I've had a significant enough experience where I didn't want to move, but I've also had a very light experience where I could go to a cafe and order coffee. Maybe it had something to do with the cultivars, but on the other hand, maybe it had something to do with the ultimate wild card, my frame of mind at the time. In the stronger experience, I had fasted and participated in a subdued and ceremonious nighttime event. In the lighter experience, or maybe this made the experience lighter out of necessity, I wanted to keep an eye on my husband, who was on a deeper trip. One characteristic of low-dose tripping is that sometimes you can pull it together if needed. On a high dose, that may be more difficult. A high dose is generally considered to be 2.5 to 5 grams and will likely produce psychedelic effects like visual and audio distortions when the eyes are open, and vivid waking dreams, memory retrieval, and stream of consciousness narratives when the eyes are closed. It can cause more intense euphoria and possibly ego dissolution, a phenomenon associated with mystical experiences and mental breakthroughs. 2.5 or 3 grams dried of Psilocybe cubensis, about the equivalent of 25 to 30 milligrams synthetic psilocybin, is a typical therapeutic dose used in clinical trials, retreats, and ceremonies. In conjunction with therapy, a high dose of psilocybin has shown positive effects for some people suffering from illness, like addictions, treatment-resistant depression, OCD, and other disorders. That's what the rapturous headlines you've been reading refer to. People who take high-dose psilocybin often speak of the benefits of integrating their trip by talking with someone afterwards, either a peer group or a trained therapist, and examining their experiences to articulate whatever learnings they believe can be gleaned. It has been characterized as an unfolding process, a continuous unraveling of insights about oneself and one's relationship, which can take place over weeks or months. This can be especially helpful if you are distressed after a bad trip. On a dose this size, it is common to feel some anxiety coming up, and it may linger, even take your trip sideways. Likewise, magic mushrooms, really in any dose, can bring up a lot of emotional stuff. I know someone who took a microdose of 150 milligrams while driving to the hardware store, became overwhelmed with nostalgia, and burst into tears. He had to pull over to recover. Emotional bloodletting of this sort isn't uncommon, and for some people it is cathartic, but of course it can also be confusing and feel inappropriate. On a high-dose trip, it's a good idea to have a trusted trip sitter around, someone who can remind you everything is okay and that the trip is temporary, and generally make sure that you don't do something stupid. 5 grams and up is colloquially what is known as a heroic dose. The term was coined by the ethnobotanist Terence McKenna. A heroic dose can lead to ego dissolution, alternate realities, and challenging but transformative insights. Not the kind of trip to go do at a bar mitzvah. Definitely not. On a dose this size, you may forget you are tripping and transcend your existence altogether. But these strong trips can be tough. It's not uncommon to throw up or lose bladder control. One tripper I spoke with said he uses magic mushrooms periodically for a burning bush moment. But he once did 15 grams of Psilocybe cubensis. That was bad. I got really scared. My temperature spiked. I had to get into an ice shower. I puked. For me, no astral projections. It was like having the flu. People have described terrifying experiences too. In one trip report I read, a fellow visualized hanging himself. Another spent his trip wandering around watching the world blow up over and over again. But people have also described ecstatic revelations about how to live their lives and insights into the nature of, well, everything. Such life-changing realizations can even lead to course redirection, which is why you should never do something dramatic after a trip, like telling your spouse you want a divorce. It makes sense to me to sit on a revelation for a while before hitting send. It's good advice. Sometimes your brain does a lot, and if you act on it while you're in that elevated state, you may make decisions that you don't necessarily agree with when your brain chemistry has calmed down a little bit. It's part of the integration. But don't confuse a heroic dose taken as a tool for exploration with a double-digit dose taken because you can't get off on a smaller one, as occurs with some people. People who take heroic doses usually expect a big light show. To those who must consume lots of psilocybin to feel any effect at all, there's nothing heroic about it. By the same token, it's not so unusual for people to brag about how much psilocybin they took regardless of whether it was planned or not. Strikes me as kind of a chest-thumping, like competing in a hot chili pepper eating contest. The last thing anyone should do, in my opinion, is judge themselves based on the amount of psilocybin they've taken. More than once, I've had trippers brush me off when I try to express my psychedelic experience on 2 grams, like it really wasn't an experience at all, and I was just embellishing. At the time, it made me feel inadequate. When I asked Dennis McKenna about the implications of a larger dose versus a smaller dose, he's kind of the king of Solomon of psychedelics, an ethnopharmacologist specializing in hallucinogenic plants and the brother of Terence. He said it takes courage to confront your inner fears and trepidations at any level of consumption. So that's what I keep in mind. How you perceive your experience is the only thing that matters, because the effects of a given dose are ultimately determined by each person's own brain chemistry. So that's very well said by Eugenia. I think she is just absolutely nailing it in this chapter. I'm going to read to the end of the chapter, if I can, so hang out. She's talking about setting intentions. This is the book, Have a Good Trip by Eugenia Bone. Highly recommend it. When I was experimenting with psychedelics in high school, we didn't think about what kind of trip we wanted, or what a particular dose would do. Our intention was to see what would happen and hopefully have a good time. I have a friend who had his first trip at 80 years old. He decided not to set an intention at all, because he didn't want to hem in his experience in any way. By the way, turns out that at a young age, psychedelic trips can become mellower. It turns out as you age, psychedelic trips can become mellower. Lots of people trip for mind expansion or just to have a good time. I've been out hunting psychedelic mushrooms with other mushroom hunters and seen them pop raw mushrooms in their mouths and they walked along, just like you do when you're strawberry picking. There was no intention other than to find more mushrooms and have fun. Those who are interested in using psychedelics for specific purposes, however, understand the importance of intention. Setting intention, having a goal for the trip, may be the single most important factor in determining individual reactions, wrote Andrew Weil. One sec. Excuse me. It's important because when you determine why you are taking the drug, it not only defines what kind of dose to take, but what kind of results you're after. There's a prescriptive approach to the drug, and it's what so many people are interested in today. People often use intentions to seek transformations. Goals such as, I want to quit drinking, how do I fix my marriage, or what path should I follow in life can anchor a trip. Some folks like to describe intention setting as asking the mushrooms, and the mushrooms give them answers they seek. That's something like the indigenous approach, where the mushrooms are associated with divine wisdom. I see intention setting as opening doorways in the mind that may allow you to see answers and solutions that have always been there, but for whatever reason haven't been obvious before. It's not uncommon for trippers to interpret images or scenes they experience as a metaphor for their intention. Those metaphors can turn out to be helpful tools going forward. Brian Richards, a scientist working on psychedelic therapy for cancer patients, told me a story about a patient in a clinical trial who had successfully, doctors say optimal, treatment for breast cancer, yet she was plagued by hypochondriacal fear. She was afraid of still being sick, which is very legit if you have cancer. Every signal of pain and discomfort associated or occasioned a panic as possible fear of reoccurrence, he told me. During her trip, she set an intention to go hunting for her fear, to find out where it was hiding in her mind and what was behind it. While tripping, she opened a door, and inside was a little cowering hedgehog. This was her fear? She held it and realized it was just trying to keep her safe from harm, to prepare her as best as it could for any future suffering. From then on, he said, she had a personally meaningful symbol to relate to that helped her discern and attenuate her symptoms. So it helped her fear go away. Emily, this is the book Have a Good Trip by Eugenia Bone. Setting intentions is an established step in many clinical trials, and it seems to be derived from a far older practice. We have only been talking about magic mushrooms in this country for 70 years, but long before they came to the attention of the non-indigenous world, they were used in ceremonies by the Mazateca people of Mexico and the native people in Central American countries. Villagers with a problem, or perhaps a physical or mental complaint, may attend a magic mushroom ceremony with a curandera, or a shaman, in the hopes that under her guidance and the spirits of the mushrooms, they might find some relief. They are not going to the curandera to get high, nor do they have a wealth of outlets for modern healthcare. They have a specific intention, and the velada, or ceremony, is designed to address. If a tripper goes on a psychedelic retreat or hires a therapist or guide to work with them, both in preparation for a trip, in therapeutic conversation afterwards, the chances are he will be asked to set an intention. I took a variety of trips researching this book, and throughout, I was asked to consider intentions to come up with the questions for the mushrooms. I have already spoken on how psilocybin helped me get over losing my youthful looks, but I didn't ask for that insight. It just came at a time when it mattered to me. Throughout my experiences, I had revelations about people I love and what they need from me, and warnings about things I do that I shouldn't. But when it came to a specific intention, I didn't know what I wanted or needed. I knew what wasn't working for me in my life. I'm dealing with getting older, yet I have no idea how I fit into the scheme of oldness. At my age, my grandfather had fully embraced Sansa belt pants and the golf cart life. I may be old, but I'm not 1975 old. Still, I was on the verge of being a senior citizen, and I felt like I was aging out of contemporary culture. Becoming the human equivalent of a VHS made me uptight and antisocial. Yet somehow examining my dread about the normal process of aging seemed unworthy, a waste of a good trip. But it turns out that nothing was wasted. Over the course of a year, tripping in various ways, I experienced a subtle but profound change in my attitude about everything, including aging. So even if you don't have an intention behind generally feeling like you are not comfortable in your skin, that may still turn out to be intention enough. So again, anyone who's listening, I'm reading from a book called Have a Good Trip by Eugenia Bone. These are not my words, I'm reading Eugenia's words. Mitigating risk. Psilocybin is widely reputed to cause no harm to your physical body. That might not be 100% true. Serotogenic agonists, drugs that stimulate serotonin receptors, do have the potential to induce valvular heart disease, and some scientists will likely have to study this to determine what constitutes safe dosing, especially in cases of frequent use, as in microdosing. An individual may be at risk based on the state of his or her mental health in general. People diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, for example, are discouraged from using this drug, and even one's state of mind in the moment. For example, tripping while sleep deprived is probably a bad idea. but the most well-known risk is self-harm occurring during a trip or harm that arises from bad judgment, like driving your car while hallucinating. Doing something potentially harmful to oneself or others may be mitigated by ensuring there are sober, competent people who will interrupt any behavior that might be dangerous, and in the process confer a sense of safety. Most trips start with a twinge of anxiety. Those anxious feelings can be dissipated if the setting feels secure, or they can accelerate if there is something or someone around that feels creepy. Anxious feelings may even precipitate a bad trip, not unlike a full-blown anxiety attack. Who a tripper surrounds him or herself with can be a tremendous asset if they help help cure or assuage, I don't know how to say that word, scary feelings as they come up. But they can also be the problem if their intentions for being there are prejudiced by their own self-interest. Of course, one can have a tough go of a trip regardless of how supportive the sitters are. So basically, like, having good people around is important. If you have bad people around that might have bad intentions towards you, it is going to be magnified if you're tripping, is kind of what she's saying. In a clinical trial, one confidence level in the sitters may be higher because in most cases you will be in the hands of a professional with licenses to protect. In a retreat setting, it's iffier. Most guides I have encountered are mindful, well-intentioned folks, but there's always the possibility that a guide won't know they shouldn't impose their cosmology or worldview on you. And this is the case, I feel like, with a lot of psychedelic retreats. People are kind of out there, and while you're tripping, you're in this like very vulnerable mental state, and having someone else like project their worldview onto you may feel very bad. I'm a scientist. If I'm in a vulnerable mental state and someone starts trying to talk to me about God and all these spiritual things, I'm going to be like, no, this doesn't jive with my worldview. I'm very uncomfortable in this setting. And it's one of the reasons that I don't like the idea of going to any of these sort of retreat-like things, because the people who run those retreats generally have very different belief systems than I do. My belief systems are based very much in fact, observational data, hypotheses. Doesn't mean that I'm not open to new experiences, but my worldview is very different from people who are deeply steeped in religion or other sort of like spiritual practices, let's say. It might not be helpful for a guide to tell you during a trip that the reason you're experiencing so much anguish is because you were a Nazi in your past life. Likewise, a trip can go south if a guide has ulterior motives for being with someone in that vulnerable state. Watch out for horny guides. I've heard a lot about that. Young women especially need to be really careful with going to isolated places where they're spending a lot of time with someone who has a lot of control and power in that setting, and then also taking psychedelic drugs. I have a friend who was almost kidnapped and raped at a fairly reputable place in Hawaii, and it was only because she got really bad vibes and someone else had been there, like, helped get her out of there. And from my perspective, she never should have gone there in the first place, because she looked later at some of the reviews of the place and was like, oh my god, this guy's clearly a predator. But, oh my god, TikTok is making me prove twice that I am a human. All right, there we go. I am still here. We're still live streaming. Okay, I'm almost done with this chapter, so we're getting there. Watch out for horny guides of some kind, or some kind of agenda to fulfill. Watch out for evangelism. So I'm talking about people trying to project their worldview onto you. If I have a bad gut feeling about someone, I'm not going to give myself over to them or their judgment. Equally important is the setting. One of the first warnings I heard about psychedelics was trip in nature rather than in the city. Magic mushrooms can enhance your experience of the outdoors, but you can also get lost or overextended physically. My husband told me a story about how, as a young man, he tripped on a campout and somehow lost his pants. Not the worst thing that can happen, but think about it. How do you lose your pants? Lots of happy trips in nature involve staying put in nature. I remember as a teenager tripping in a blooming apple orchard. I felt safe and was preoccupied for hours by the soft pink flowers, periodically tossed in the air by a warm breeze, the fat bees buzzing about in slow motion. Music festivals and raves can create a sense of safety in numbers and like-minded users. But I've also heard many stories of bad trips that occurred when folks lost their friends in the crowd. And cities are chaotic places, full of variables and distractions, and police officers who might not recognize your odd behavior as the result of a psychedelic, not psychosis. The two can look similar. A good setting, or the right setting for you, can make a world of difference. Ginger Nerd, I fully disagree with you. Nah. The setting of a professional clinic trial may provide a sense of a safe space. In most cases, you have confidence. There is quick access to medical personnel if needed, usually not. But not many people will get into a clinical trial. If they can afford it, they will go to a retreat. Many retreats are held in beautiful vacation settings, but ultimately how secure those settings are is relative to the number of guests or guides present to oversee all the trippers. If a place seems skeevy to you, I'd recommend eating the money you spent and just going home. Alternatively, many folks make private arrangements to trip at home or in the home of a friend, settings that are animus-free. In the past, I've worried about things like, what if the FedEx guy shows up? What if my landlord calls? For such eventualities, it's a good idea to have someone around to run interference. We've all forgotten how to turn off our phones, that we don't need or have to respond to everything instantly. A trip is a good time to remember. Turn off your phone. You're not going to be able to use it anyhow. What you can't forget is that in most places, psilocybin is illegal. It's a Schedule I drug. The potential of psilocybin to treat mental disorders has led to a general social relaxation about it, to the point where it seems to be legal, but that attitude can backfire in the wrong time and place. If psychedelics are something you think more people should have safe access to, then write your state representatives. You won't be the first person to tell them so. But what she's getting at is don't go around telling everyone you're on mushrooms and then end up getting arrested. That'll be a very bad trip. It is wise to keep your mouth shut, keep your experience intentional, small, risk-free, and have a sense of safety in what you're doing. I do recommend being in nature, but like she said, don't overextend yourself. Maybe don't lose your pants. Try to be around people that are going to be safe and good to be around. A trip, and this is her equation, and I really like it. A trip is determined by dose plus intention minus risk. Great equation. Understanding the relationship between the species of mushrooms, the size of the dose, and your intention in taking them can increase the chances you will make good choices. You might not want to bother with microdosing. If you are searching for a mystical experience, you may just end up organizing your sock drawer. That happens. You probably don't want to take a heroic-sized trip if you are hoping to be more effective at a brainstorming meeting. It's dialing in your dosage, as you could end up lying under your desk with your jacket over your face. And that would be very weird in a social setting. Similarly, understanding the known risks and seeking to mitigate them also increases your ability to make good choices. It's too bad the science is not ready for many people who have expressed an interest in psilocybin, and unfortunately, anecdotal knowledge doesn't rise to the same reproducible standards as scientific inquiry. But there's a lot of human experience using magic mushrooms, and much of it may be useful if you know how to evaluate what trippers say. And that's basically why she wrote this book. So this is the book, Have a Good Trip by Eugenia Bone, and it's a deep dive specifically into magic mushrooms, but her experiences with it, personal as well as in the community. She speaks about the science, she speaks about the sort of social factors at play. She speaks about recent changes in legislation, ongoing medical trials, all sorts of stuff. So it's a really good book if you're interested in the subject. It's something I wish I could talk about more on social media, but I can't. And so I'm letting Eugenia do it for me. And at some point I will actually do an interview with her on Instagram Live, and that'll probably go up on YouTube as well. So anyhow, I hope you guys enjoyed hearing me read chapter 1 of that book. I'm going to continue reading this when I have a chance. So Jeremy, I'm reading from a book. It's very different from me speaking about this on my own. And this is very objective, right? It's written in a way that we can talk about it. Most lives get shut down because someone reports them as well. So that's part of it. I've gotten lucky so far. The last few times I went live, God, someone reported me for like selling stuff. I wasn't selling it. I was literally like showing people mushrooms, and someone reported me for like, you know, bad business practices basically, and it tanked my account for like over a month. Most of my videos, I don't even get 10K views. I have 2 million followers. I can't break 10,000 views on most of my videos. So I've seen a lot of creators talking about how like TikTok is kind of a dead platform. I don't disagree. I mean, I've thought about, I don't really feel like live streaming much anymore. I'm doing this because I'm reading the book. I'd be better served live streaming on YouTube than TikTok, to be completely frank. I don't make money from this. I don't really want to, but I do make money on YouTube in a way that I don't here on TikTok. It's kind of absurd, the difference there. TikTok, they have this new creator program where videos over a minute earn money, but I actually have made less with that than I used to make off of their thing where they paid you for short form content. Because my short form content was far more popular. I actually hate YouTube as a platform. I don't watch stuff on YouTube, but they do treat creators better. I wish that TikTok was still what it was, because I really miss old TikTok. It was fun. It was weird. It was strange. Things moved quickly. And it was so much better than YouTube or Instagram or any other platform. And there's still my favorite creators are on here. And I'd prefer to watch the content on here. I find YouTube Shorts to be inane and stupid. They don't have a good algorithm. Instagram has a shit algorithm. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer. Yeah, I mean, I'm feeling pretty blah about social media in general. I have a book to promote, though, so I need to be active on social media, and it's literally my job, so I do this. That's what it is. Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate y'all being here. One more plug for Eugenia. She wrote the foreword to my book, and I'm a big fan of hers, so that's part of why I'm doing this. Like I said, I'm probably going to interview her at some point, and this is part of why I'm reading it for you guys. I can't really afford to hate any platform since I'm active on all of them. I get a lot of people who are like, I would never use a Meta product, and some people are like, I would never go on TikTok. It's so funny to me that people like hate these different platforms, and it's like they're all the same thing, inevitably.